Giants, blood drinkers, and King David. That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. I am here with my guest, Father Stephen DeYoung. Father, good to see you again.
Yes, good to be here again.
Yes. So I on today's episode, what I wanted to do is, I want to start by making people aware of something that maybe not everyone out there is aware of. So there's been a big Amazon Studios, Amazon original show, House of David, that, caused some rumbles out there in the world. This being about, of course, King David, and the show tracks, it begins at the, at the slaying of the Amalekites, and then it goes all the way up through the slaying of Goliath. That's season one. What a lot of folks may not be aware of is that both you and I were involved in that show in various capacities. So I was involved in the original conception of the show, heavily involved in the early versions of it as it was written before it moved into the hands of Amazon. My role as a writer was reduced after Amazon took over the show and was further reduced in working on season 2. But nonetheless, I continue to work as a writing co-executive producer involved in the show. And you, Father, continued to be involved as we needed someone to consult with, as I was pulling in various experts, which you were one of my main go-tos on various things as we worked through this process of bringing this show to light. Now, I'm not at liberty to really say much about the show itself, but we are at liberty to talk about the source material. And so today what I wanted to do is just have a conversation with you here publicly, the sort of conversations that we've had for years now, really about the source material and about Midrash and about, the ancient Near East and all sorts of things that would intersect with a story of this kind. So that is what's on the docket. By the way, how many people out there, Father, are aware that you had any involvement in the show?
Mainly people on my Marvel Rivals Twitch stream. Because as soon as the show came out, people started asking me about it.
Okay.
They're like, "Oh, what do you think of this show?" And then, actually,
funny story.
I consulted on that show. But then I have to sort of explain what that means, which is I was asked for input on varirious things. I gave input, and they did what they would with my input.
That is how it works. Yep.
Yeah.
You got it. Well, let's talk a bit about the source material that they're actually working with. And I'm going to just kind of bounce around to different topics that I think are particularly interesting and might be particularly interesting to listeners out there who have, any interest in David and the story of David generally, which I think is a pretty large audience, would be my guess. So let's start with David himself. David, this character of David, in general, I want to come back to just sort of the character himself. But one of the things that David talks about often in his writings, fairly often, is this idea that he's somehow an outcast, right? And that there's, in some sense, he seems to have as part of his persona, as part of his life experience, being shunned in some way. And my understanding is also that in Jewish Midrash, this is sort of expanded in ways like he's not allowed to eat with certain members of the family and things like this. This is actually elaborated in various ways. So I'd be curious to ask, let's start with this question of why is that, right? What are the possible explanations that are out there? Because, and I say possible explanations because you and I both know there's not a single explanation that floats about in traditions about this. So what are the possible explanations that float about why this would be part of David's experience?
Yeah. And when we're talking about his writings, we're talking mainly about Psalms attributed.
Pretty much,
to
yes.
him.
That's
and
correct.
Then sort of bits and bobs derived from the narrative of his life, especially in First and Second Samuel.
Right.
There are lots of ways to interpret that. I mean, probably most sort of random Christians who learned about David in Sunday school right, or who read those Psalms,
Uh-huh.
attribute a lot of that to, say, when he was being chased by Saul,
Mm-hmm.
or even when he was sort of displaced from the throne by Absalom, his son.
Right.
Right. They say, oh, well, it must be right.
Right.
Those kind of things.
Yeah, and
Right.
you do see this, right? I'm thinking of is it Spurgeon who did like a chronological order of David's Psalms or something like this,
Yeah.
and he's trying to he's trying to basically connect. Well, this is happening in this life event, and David's life, and this
Right.
one, attach to that one. And you're right that the majority of those sorts of tethers that people create are tied to the later life of David
Right.
as opposed to his early one, and then certain things like I was conceived in sin or sins, if you're using Septuagint, right? Like, usually that's then just sort of, whitewashed with like, well, it's original sin. It's the doctrine of
It's
original
a proof
sin.
text.
Right,
It's
right. A proof text, right.
Frankly.
Yeah, it has nothing to do
Yeah.
with David's life or something like that. But that's,
Yeah.
that's not always how
Right.
it's been read.
Right. Yeah. And that is taken to be just sort of a programmatic statement rather than a particular statement about David.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas there are strong traditions in the Jewish tradition, the pre-Christian Jewish tradition,
Mm-hmm.
and subsequent tradition, that this is actually referring to David in particular.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That he was the reason why he's sort of the youngest child and isn't with the other brothers, and these kind of observable things, is that he was born out of an affair. He was born out of wedlock.
Mm-hmm.
He was illegitimate, and therefore was sort of treated accordingly
Mm-hmm.
by his family of origin, and even by the larger, clan he was part of within Judah, and sort of the wider community. And that then led to him ending up sort of working as a mercenary leader for the Philistines, and that these sort of things are all connected and develop out of that family of origin, rather than those just being happenstance later, and then he reflects his feelings about those happenstances.
Yeah. Now my understanding is that there's like also something here going on with regard to basically the fact that there's Moabite heritage as well. Isn't there like this entire tradition having to do with, well, maybe it's because you're not supposed to marry Moabites. And so being part of the descent of Moabite, there's something dicey, about basically his origin, in that sense as well.
Right. And that comes out of a later. So when you read the actual text of the Torah and the Deuteronomistic history, it's very much about integration in the sense that, it makes very plain that Israel, and the earlier you go in Israel, the more so is not ethnically united, right? In our modern terms,
right?
It is ethnically diverse. There are lots of people marrying in from different backgrounds, right? Phineas, who ends up being the third high priest of Israel, his name Pinehas is the Egyptian word for black-skinned one.
Right.
It's one of the words they used to refer to Nubians, because his mother was from Put, southern Libya. Right. And so ethnically, this is not an Abrahamite, let alone what would later become an Israelite. But that's deliberate included. But what you find, starting with the post-exilic period, when you have the warnings from Ezra about foreign wives, and this kind of thing, is a reinterpretation within the Jewish tradition that sort of reads all those texts in the opposite way. So the mixed multitude that comes out of Egypt, well, it's all the non-Israelites who are the source of all the grumbling and all the problems.
Right.
And, this isn't a story of Ruth being included in the people of God. This is a story of, oh, well, there's, someone who shouldn't be there in the in the line of descent there. Yeah. And so, yes, there is sort of this idea that we have this problematic, problematic circumstance of his birth. And sort of the New Testament genealogies then reread that
Right.
Right. Back in more the original way,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that they make a point of Ruth being in there, Tamar being in there,
Right.
right.
Bathsheba
Rahab
being
being in there,
right. Yeah.
in
Um,
Christ's genealogy.
yeah. Yeah. And so my understanding of this sort of later version having to do with the Moabite tradition, if I'm remembering correctly, like part of this is then in this case, the problem would be less, David's mother, and it would be more Jesse himself, right? The idea that Jesse is from that line. Which then creates this question of whether or not his union with his wife. And my understanding, I'm trying to remember if I have this story correct, and you can remind me if. But that there's at least one tradition where Jesse, for that reason, being a pious man, because according to tradition, Jesse is actually a pretty saintly, upright, righteous guy.
Yeah, that's why he's still commemorated as a prophet, like in the Orthodox Church. And people go, well, why? He doesn't prophesy. He doesn't do much in the biblical narrative.
Right. So I don't know if everybody knows that. So like when you say that, I mean, for people who don't know, you as a priest obviously do it every divine liturgy, right?
Yeah.
Or in preparation for every divine liturgy. Can you tell people about that?
Yeah. In the preparation for the divine liturgy, you sort of on the paten, which is the disc, the round sort of dish, I guess, for people totally not
familiar. Yeah.
That's where the bread is going to be for the Eucharist, right? For communion. You sort of construct an icon or an image of God's divine counsel on it, right? So you have a central portion of the holy bread that represents Christ, that's going to be used for communion, right? The Eucharist. And then you have particles representing his mother, the Old Testament prophets, the apostles, the different categories of saints sort of surrounding him, and this image of them surrounding his throne. And then you commemorate people who you're praying for, sort of beneath that, sort of on the earth beneath, right?
Right.
In this sort of image. And one of those categories is the Old Testament prophets, and Jesse is by name, right? You sort of name several and all the prophets.
Right. Yeah.
End of it. But Jesse is one of the ones who's named.
Right.
And that seems very peculiar.
Right.
To a lot of people, because in the biblical narrative itself, regardless of which version you're reading, he doesn't do any prophesying. He doesn't do much at all except be David's dad.
Right. Yeah. So Jesse is, and I say that, lest anybody think the scandal around David has to do with the idea that Jesse was seen as a bad guy or something like that. Right. He's definitely not treated that way. And in fact, in that Moabite tradition, my recollection, and again, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my recollection is that Jesse pietistically is like, oh, shoot. Maybe me being from this Moabite line, I shouldn't be married to a pure, Hebrew. And so for that reason, I should take a Canaanite concubine instead, and then my recollection is something like there's a switcheroo, as sometimes happens with wives when too much alcohol has happened. So the concubine loving Nitzevet, which is the name we have from tradition for David's mother, ends up, switching out because she doesn't want to break Nitzevet's heart. And so Nitzevet ends up conceiving. And this is part of what raises the question of, well, who got her pregnant and all that sort of stuff. And so that is at least one, my recollection is that's one of the stories by which you sort of get to have your cake and eat it too. Scandal around David's conception. Jesse's still a righteous man, pietistic motives, explaining why he's an outcast, all that sort of stuff.
Right. And this is a good example of how Jewish tradition developed in the Second Temple period, because what you have there is the collision of a couple traditions, and then we find a way to reconcile it.
Right. Yes.
Right. So we have these traditions that Jesse is this righteous man. Right. And we have these traditions that David is from another mother.
Right.
Well, how do we reconcile these two?
Right. Yeah.
Right? And so we come up with a story with a lot of parallels, like in the story of Jacob in Genesis. And Right.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So we preserve his righteousness and preserve David's from another mother.
That's
and
right.
We right? Preserve
Right.
all of these things together, right?
Right. Well, so this actually gets to something that I wanted to just orient people to, because inevitably, when you and I talk about these things, we're going to have to talk about Jewish traditions, right? Certain
Right.
Jewish traditions about this. And so, again, for folks who are not familiar with this sort of territory, this is all very foreign to them. When we talk about these sorts of different traditions like you have, what are we really talking about? Where are these preserved? How do these come down? What level of authority do they have? You give us, for the uninitiated, offer us a little bit of, offer us some thoughts on just sort of getting our bearings with these sorts of things.
Yeah. What we're really talking about when we talk about these traditions. So tradition gets used to describe a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
So like traditions gets used to describe practices, for example, or,
Sure.
Ways of doing things or this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you could talk about, well, we have the way the Day of Atonement ritual is laid out in Leviticus 16, but then there's also the tradition of tying a scarlet cord around the goat. And later on, they developed the tradition of pushing the goat off a cliff. That's not in the biblical text, but it's something they start doing, right? But that's not the kind of tradition we're talking about here.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And this kind of tradition is more sort of troublesome for people because it's actual sort of content that's not spelled out in the Bible. And by people here, I mean our Protestant friends,
right?
Because of sola scriptura and stuff,
right?
The stuff that isn't in the Bible but is being referenced, right?
Right.
And what that really constitutes is these are interpretations of the Bible made by prominent interpreters over the course of history. And the prominence and authority of those interpreters lends weight to their interpretation over against the panoply of other possible interpretations.
Right.
And if you don't think the Bible is capable of a multiplicity of interpretations, go look up an issue of the Journal of Biblical Literature, right, and read, queer theory about Ezekiel and
right.
There's a potentially infinite number of interpretations.
That's right.
But there were sort of prominent teachers and scholars of scripture all through Jewish history and Christian history.
Right.
And the Jewish traditions we're referring to are those traditions. And the later ones, starting around the 1st century AD, are sort of preserved in the Talmud, right? That's what the Jewish Talmud is. It's just a series of quotations. This famous rabbi said this regarding this part of the Torah, or he answered this question this way. And then in the Talmud, you'll then have a bunch of other rabbis saying seemingly contradictory things.
Right, sure, right.
The religion of Judaism is basically a long series of arguments, right?
Right.
But when we're talking about the Second Temple period, which runs from the building of not Solomon's temple, but the Second Temple in Jerusalem, so around 500 AD, or 500 BC, 500 BC to 70 AD. Those are the Jewish traditions we're primarily talking about here. Those are preserved for us in other ways. Some of the early Midrash, which is sort of an expansionist retelling of stories within the canonical Hebrew Bible, but then also their predecessor, the Targums, which were translations into Aramaic of the Hebrew Bible, but they were translations more like the Living Bible and less like modern biblical translations, and that they're not word for word and will include whole sentences and whole stories.
Sure.
But those stories are interpretations and answers to particular questions that people had while reading the text.
Right. Yeah. So if somebody wanted to actually start to dig around in these just out of their own curiosity, where would they begin to find these sorts of things? Obviously, you can look up the Talmud. But obviously that's a later
with the memory
collection.
that's later.
Yeah, that's right. And so in terms of a lot of the sorts of things that we're talking about, where would, what sort of sources would be accessible, to the common person?
None of it is super accessible because the English translations of this stuff are kind of prohibitively expensive in a lot of cases.
Yeah, sure.
But if you have access to a good library, if you have access to like a school library,
there are still uses for that.
A theological school library. Yeah. You could get access to, as I mentioned, the Targums. There are several of them that date to different times and come from different places, that have been translated into English. And you're talking about dozens of volumes, and it's hundreds of dollars a volume. That's why I'm talking about using
Go find a library. Yeah.
And also several midrashes that date from different times and written by different people are available in different places. The affordable option in terms of getting some of this is actual literature from that period. Books that are, in those documentaries banned from the Bible, even though they never actually were.
Right.
And the most affordable collection of that. So if you want an entry point and something you could actually afford to buy, the average person listening to this, there is a pretty nice 2-volume collection of this stuff translated by Charles Worth called Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. And that you can get. It's 2 big, chunky, like 1,200 page paperback books, big digest books. Usually, and they pay me nothing to say this, it is just something I have factually observed. ChristianBook.com.
Hey, look at that.
Usually has the cheapest price on that 2-volume set.
Today's episode sponsored by Christian.
It's usually cheaper than Amazon, right? So that's just save yourself a couple of bucks. But you can get that for between $40 and $60, depending on sales and stuff. So that's a good place to start. And that gives you dozens and dozens of these texts, all of which ultimately are sort of commentaries and expansions on biblical texts, right? And fleshing out of stories with the preserving these traditional ways of interpreting and understanding them.
Right.
The controversial part of this is that in the New Testament, very frequently, the New Testament writers, including like the Apostle Paul, when they reference things from the Old Testament, will reference these traditions as part of their reference, and they don't make any distinction between these traditions of interpretation and the text itself. Right. There are some obvious examples, like St. Paul referring to the rock that followed Israel in the wilderness. Right. This is a tradition that's preserved in several of the midrashes, because people ask the question, okay, at the beginning of the 40 years, Israel gets water from this rock. At the end of the 40 years, Israel gets water from this rock. Where did they get the water in the desert for the middle part of that 40 years? Right. And so this tradition developed an answer to that question that, well, the rock followed them, and wherever they made camp, the rock sort of reappeared. And then that got elaborated on over time to, yes, and they would sing this song when they made camp. Right. To sort of call the rock. Right. And it gets elaborated on. But St. Paul just refers to the rock following them and doesn't feel the need to say. Right. Like, well, technically the Bible just says, that they had this rock. Sure. But, there's a tradition, for whatever weight you put on that it followed them. Right. St. Paul just refers to the rock that followed them. Right. Right. Or when he talks about Jannes and Jambres contesting with Moses, right? You won't find those names in the Torah, but those names come out of the subsequent expansions on that story. Right. Yeah. And now, so this is obviously, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, because it would be a longer discussion about, again, sort of the level of authority. Well, if we look at scripture as God breathed, but then we have these other traditions, and how do you balance these sorts of things? That would be a much longer aside that would carry us far afield of all the things that I'd like us to talk about today. But I do want to just make a comment here that in some ways, the abstract nature of
rabbinic discussion really took on concrete reality for me in the writer's room. And what I mean by that is that you start to see when you start to have to take a story and turn it into a fully fleshed out narrative with motives and desires, wants, all these sorts of things, you start to realize how many holes there are in the biblical story, right? It is not telling you all that. It'll just tell you that a thing happens, and it won't necessarily tell you why it happens or what motivates that thing. And when you start asking of the text very specific questions of like, well, why did they do that? I mean, for example, let's just take the Philistines, right? The Philistines wait 40 days. They've got giants, or at least one of them, and they've got superior numbers, and they have superior armor and weaponry and all of this sort of stuff. Why do they wait 40 days? And the biblical text doesn't tell you, right? And so you're all of a sudden, if you're going to paint a viable narrative, you're actually forced to start to explore speculatively, like, well, why would that be? And similarly, again, like we saw it here when we were talking about, okay, well, you have certain data points about David, right? He seems to be an outcast, but Jesse seems to be a righteous guy, but there's still somehow some sort of disconnect there. And as we talked about in at least that Moabite version of the story, that's one of the way of threading that needle, right? And saying, okay, we have all these points. Here's one way you could hypothetically bring those together in a coherent fashion. And so I'll just say, in some ways, while I was already aware that obviously Jewish tradition does this, once I was thrust into a writing room where you're forced to look at this from a narratival perspective, you start to see just how many gaps in the story there are and why rabbis would be continually debating how do you connect, point A to point B. And so I just say that, this actually does make a great deal of sense that this would be the nature of rabbinic dialogue over the years. But of course, as we've also said, there's not always a consistent singular interpretation of what the answer might be with regard to any of these things. Out of curiosity, since just to bring it back to where we started, which was this question about David being an outcast, and we talked about a couple of different possibilities there. What do you think about the theory, which, as far as I know, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think this actually comes out of Jewish tradition. I think this is more of a contemporary biblical studies theory, which is that David is somehow descended from Nahash. That in some ways, Nitzevet, if you look at the genealogy, there's a subtle nod to the idea that maybe one of David's sisters is descended from Nahash, the pagan king who would gouge out people's eyes. And so perhaps Nitzevet is sort of the shamed ex-wife of him. And for that reason, hating him means hating her and, then hating the offspring of her and Jesse taking her in, and marrying her would somehow do shame. Do you think there's any legitimacy to that? And am I correct that that's more of a contemporary theory than it is a Jewish one?
Yeah, that's a contemporary thing. And I mean, there are an endless number of plausible things, right?
Sure. Maybe plausible isn't the right question.
I give ancient interpretations that have sort of stood the test of time,
right,
more weight than the modern imagination.
Sure. Fair enough. Fair enough. I mean, look, hey, I'm fine with that.
That's very a TLDR answer, but yeah, that's and I don't and part of the thing with the modern imagination, right, is modern understanding of psychology. So I think we ought to read people the way they read other people. Right? Like if we have examples of how they read and interpret texts, we ought to interpret their text that way.
Yeah.
And modern scholarship tends to read all texts as having some kind of agenda.
Oh my gosh.
To promote something or to hide something.
That's right.
And so I therefore take for granted that all modern scholars are writing with an agenda.
Right.
And that's why they interpret everyone else that way.
That's right. Okay, just as an aside here for people who are unfamiliar, it is so cynical. Biblical studies of today is so cynical because you're right? Like everything is about, well, clearly David's just trying to consolidate his power. So this is why, we have this tradition here, or this is why this group over here is trying to consolidate their power, or they're trying to whitewash something from the past, or, like
cover up XYZ.
Yeah. Everything in biblical studies, any interpretation that is, the more cynical, the better. It basically is what it comes down to. I mean, I think there's sort of two guys.
When it pertains to Israel.
Yeah, that's right.
When it pertains to pagans, we have to give them the most beneficent.
We have to give them the benefit
possible.
of the doubt. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. No, and we talked about in your previous appearance on my podcast, we talked about sort of that odd thing where the presumption is also they're very dumb. And so, the sort of lower brow, the interpretation, the better. We talked about that. You can see that prior episode for that. But yes, cynical it's unbelievably cynical when it comes to motivations behind the biblical text.
Yeah. Yeah. So in a lot of attempts to try to connect the things to paganism, I take it as part of paganism was actually really good compared to, right. So, we're in this weird place where we have to do everything possible to deny that the Phoenicians ever sacrificed a baby.
Sure.
While affirming that the Old Testament is covering up that the Israelites sacrificed babies.
That's right.
Like at the same time.
Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yes, I don't know that a lot of people are aware of that. I mean, anybody who's in biblical studies should be aware of that. It's hard. Yeah. I mean, you bump up against it immediately, no matter where you go.
Yeah. But any of those proposals, I just read with the same cynicism that they read everyone else. Like, what are they trying to do here?
That's right. Well, that's fair. Look, that's completely fair. That is my disposition toward modern biblical studies as well. So. Fair enough. Let's talk a little bit about just the character of David himself. He is. I want to maybe poke fun and add a little bit the VeggieTales version of David, right?
Yeah.
Sorry out there if people love VeggieTales,
which I call the Sunday school version because I'm older than you.
That's right. Right. Yeah. Okay. So there. Yes. Well, it is also. Yeah. I could have called it like the felt board. I never had a felt board, but I've heard the
flanograph. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Felt board, David. The flanograph, David. Where it seems to be pretty common sort of evangelical Protestant lore. Whether you're talking about the picture Bible or you're talking about VeggieTales or you're talking about the flanograph, David's a little kid. Giant's really big. He's got a toy slingshot, a kid's toy. And the miracle is that, that takes out the giant. Yes or no? I mean, I don't want to lead the witness, but...
Right.
Hi, I'm Dr. Nathan Jacobs, scholar in residence at Vanderbilt and host of the Nathan Jacobs Podcast, and I'm inviting you to join my Introduction to Philosophy class starting August 7th, with lectures every Thursday at 7 p.m. Central. You get 22 hours of live, interactive lectures with me over the course of 13 weeks as we survey the history of ideas from ancient to modern philosophy. Can't make it live? No problem. It's all recorded, and everyone registered for the class will have access to those recordings. You can audit the class and simply enjoy the lectures and interactions, or take it for credit. Transcripts will be available showing the class is accredited should you want to transfer to a college of your choosing. Register by August 4th. To sign up, visit myproffer.com today. See description for details. And a quick note about Proffer. Higher education is broken, and Proffer is working hard to fix it. You'll be hearing a lot about this company in the coming years. It's a tech startup aimed at revolutionizing higher ed through decentralized, independent learning. Why do I trust them? Because I'm the CEO. Our mission is to make accredited college courses available from the best educators in the world at a fraction of the cost, with maximal flexibility for both educators and students. Our website may look a little rough around the edges during this beta phase, but the education is world-class. We're bringing in professors from Notre Dame, Stanford, Northern Arizona University, and more just for our beta test. Their courses go live in the coming weeks, but don't be surprised if, at the moment, you see only me and my course on the site. So be amongst the first to join the revolution in higher ed by going to myproffer.com and signing up for my class today. Now, back to the show.
So, there are a couple confusions there. One basic thing with David that most people don't know is there's a chunk of the story of David that's kind of a mess in terms of the biblical text. And this will make people of a certain stripe and a certain upbringing very uncomfortable, but it is a matter of fact. So we have to deal with actual facts, whether we like them or not. So the story of David as it's preserved in the Greek text is much shorter than what's in the Hebrew text.
Right.
And in the Hebrew text, there are a whole bunch of things that happen twice. And I don't mean happen twice like repetition. I mean happen twice like two different stories of the same thing happening in different ways. Like David meets Saul for the first time twice in two different ways in the Hebrew text. And only once in the Greek text, because the Greek text only preserves one version.
Right.
And we have essentially two versions of the story woven together in the Hebrew text. So the Greek text is preserving one set of David traditions translated from the Hebrew. The Hebrew text we have now has these two different sets of tradition woven together, but a chunk of it in Samuel is corrupt.
Right.
And I mean corrupt as in the Hebrew is corrupt. You can't read it.
Right. Yeah.
In the Hebrew.
Yeah.
And so every English Bible is using the Greek as a crutch.
Right.
Because that's what St. Jerome did when he translated it into Latin, was use the Greek as a crutch.
Right. Yeah. And this, by the way, for people who don't know, this happens, right? So like, for example, my recollection is that where it says like how long Saul reigned, it's like he reigned and then the number is just gone. Like we don't know.
Yeah. That's what we mean by corrupt. Like it's not translatable.
And I think it's based on a passage in the New Testament, really, where that's sort of used authoritatively as probably a more accurate number. It's something like that, right?
Yeah. And then getting numbers out of the Greek.
And yes, and out of the Septuagint. Yeah.
Right. Which St. Jerome kind of had one eye on all the time.
Right.
That's because his Greek was a lot better than his Hebrew.
Augustine was scandalized. He thought he should have had two eyes on it, though.
Well, yeah. Right. Well, Augustine didn't know any Greek or Hebrew. So.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah.
But yeah, so that's the case in the text that we're dealing with.
Yes.
And a big chunk of that Goliath story is David meeting Saul for the first time. That's why it's sort of relevant.
Right.
Another piece that's highly relevant to that is that the Hebrew word that's used to describe David, this is one of the most misunderstood words of the Old Testament. And there is a great article that you can find on this online by Rodney Cloud, who I had as a professor at one point, a Hebrew professor at one point, who does this sort of massive study of the Hebrew word na'ar, which tends in our modern English translations to get translated as boy, right? Or youth. And it's a lot more complex than that.
Right.
There are, when you look at how that gets translated into Greek, in the Greek Old Testament, there are 16 different Greek words that are used in different places to translate that one Hebrew word. And only one of them means boy.
Yeah.
The other 15 mean other things.
Right.
Radically different things. And the most common use for it turns out in the Old Testament, is actually to describe a young official, like a young court official. Someone with a government or military office, but like low grade, right? Like buck private, or, you know, just made it out of OCS lieutenant, right? Like, or, you know, congressional page in our modern, right? Like sort of the lowest tier of, you know, that's usually inhabited by younger people, but not actual children. Right. And so how you translate that word makes a big difference. For example, when the she bear with Elisha comes out and mauls what we're led to believe by the English is a roving band of 75 children wandering the roads
Right.
between cities.
Yeah, you just see a playground in your imagination with a bear coming out.
Yes, like Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome or something. That's where these are actually young, like government officials, right?
Mm-hmm.
And soldiers. And so, for example, that's what David actually is.
Right.
And is being described as at that point. So he is not just some shepherd boy who wanders into the tent and is like, I can lick him,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Also, let's along these lines, the slingshot.
Yes.
Kid's toy?
Yeah. No, this is so what people don't understand, and especially in this instance, again, if you and this is in the text, if you read the text closely, right, though it's not in the Sunday school version, the Israelite military did not have weapons.
Right.
The blacksmiths had been done away. The Philistines were controlling the technological level, right? They were not allowing them to develop nuclear power.
Right.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
The Philistines had not allowing them to develop weapons technology. Right.
Uh-huh.
So the weapons people are using, right, the quote unquote swords they're using, this whole thing about beating swords into plowshares and vice versa is very real. They're taking like scythes and sickles that they used for farming.
Right.
Sort of trying to put a better edge on it. That's the swords we're talking about.
Right. Which isn't historically odd in general. I mean, like, fun fact, right? Nunchucks were originally they were originally a farming tool.
Yeah.
So like you had
for threshing. Yeah. Great. Yeah. Right.
So
and so there weren't like standing armies. They didn't have like equipment lockers, right? These were farmers who were of military service age,
right,
and able-bodied, who were called up, and they just had whatever that clubs, farming implements, slings,
right?
Right. That's what they had to make war, and so the Philistines had blacksmiths who were making iron weapons. They had some bronze. But this is why the description of Goliath having all this bronze, the technology to smelt bronze had been lost.
Right.
This is a relic from before the Bronze Age collapse. This is another thing. People don't realize that the whole story of Saul and David is set like post-apocalyptic.
Yes, I want to get back to that because that's, I mean, that's a great little fun fact.
So like Goliath has all this like ancient, unknown, now unreproducible technology, right? And Saul had a bronze helmet, but these are like, when you read about Saul's armor, it's like this hodgepodge of like captured, armors and technology that he looted off the bodies of people he killed, probably, literally.
Right. And that's well, we can come back to Saul, but I mean, and that probably does have to do with this attempt of sort of posing, in this role of a king, right, which is a new thing for them, in the sense that, he's presenting as if he's a Philistine ruler, sort of thing.
But it's still a hodgepodge. It's like, he was the leader of the D&D party, so he got the best loot off of everybody they killed and sort of put together this.
That's right.
and this is part of why David's not comfortable in it, right? Because it's like this hodgepodge of, like, this is the best stuff we've found, so it's the king's armor,
Right. Yeah.
And so, the sling was actually one of their better and more effective weapons.
Right.
They had available to them.
Yeah.
Obviously, the average Philistine soldier, and David later, when he was a mercenary working for the Philistines, had better stuff, right? But at the time, right, this was not, a kid with his toy slingshot, right? Going to.
And don't we even have accounts, right? Is it in Judges where they talk about basically these marksmen, who are all using slings?
No, they would have, the way we think about like medieval battles, this is part of the problem, is that we project, Saul's a king, and so we project like, medieval kings, and he had a castle and archers and, guys with swords and guys on horseback. No, none of that, right? And he was kind of a warlord,
right? More of a chieftain than
more
he
like
was.
Conan, right?
That's right. Right.
And they had they didn't have the bow people at the back. They had slingers at the back, right? Who were, trained and practiced, right? Killing things and people right, with a very high velocity, projectiles, often rocks, sometimes other things, bits of metal and trash and glass and
Yeah.
that's
So I've never said this to you before, but I'll just sort of float it, and you tell me whether or not you would agree or disagree. I mean, one of the things that along these lines of critiquing, VeggieTale, David, is that it's always presented as a miracle, right? Like it's a miracle that this little kid with a shoddy kid's toy kills a giant, right? Like that's kind of how it's presented. And then, and so that's why it's all about like, he's big and I'm little and, but I'm scared, but God's big and all that sort of stuff. But it seems like, the way I read it, given what I know about, ancient slingers and the fact that, I mean, like, look, if somebody's going to, the speed and velocity of rock flying at your head, not a kid's toy, right? Like, this is a deadly weapon. And so the idea that you have a young man who has inordinate amounts of time to be very practiced and precise with what is essentially a sniper rifle, goes out into the valley and fires a shot and hits him in the head, right? Like, I don't see that presented in the biblical text as necessarily like a miracle. I mean, this is basically Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where there's the guy with the sword, swinging around, and then he pulls out the gun and fires, and he hits him, and then he turns around and he's dead. The thing that galvanized people was not the fact that he made the shot, right, so to speak. The thing that sobered everybody up was that David was the guy who had the balls to go out there and say, we have God on our side. He's promised to bless us, bless those who bless us, curse those who curse us. And that guy's, called down curses upon us. I'm going to go take his head off his shoulders. And they're like, who's this mofo? Right. Like once he says that, and he actually goes out there and he trash talks Goliath, which is actually pretty foul trash talking.
Well, David is the greatest trash talker of the ancient world. Like he's WWE levels, like
that's
the
right.
Rock level of trash talker throughout his story. If you read the Hebrew,
right? So let's come back to that. But he basically comes out there and says like, like you're worse than a dog. You're a temple whore, and I'm going to take your head off your shoulders, and I'm going to feed you to the crows. That everybody here knows there's a God in Israel, and everybody who's been terrified is looking at each other like, who's this guy? Yeah. And then he does it, right? He makes the shot and he decapitates him. And so when I look at that, what I see there is less a miracle that a single shot could take down somebody, a headshot could take down somebody, even a giant, and more that it's the boldness of David and his trust in God to be faithful to his people. And the fact that he goes out there and boldly, while everybody's trembling, goes out there and does that is the thing that galvanizes people around him. That's how I read it. I don't necessarily read in there that there's a grand miracle that he kills Goliath. Agree? Disagree?
Right. I mean, he would objectively be considered the underdog, right? If you were taking betting odds, right?
Sure, right.
But I think that's greatly exaggerated.
Yeah. Right.
The way that's retold in that Sunday school setting does greatly exaggerate that.
And
I think so. Part of the problem with how most modern people, and this isn't confined to scholarship, right? This isn't a conservative liberal thing. This is is that what a lot of folks don't understand is that the rest of the Hebrew Bible or the rest of the Old Testament is all basically interpretation of the Torah. So anytime your first go-to in interpreting any story, the rest of the Hebrew Bible is, are there parallels to this in the Torah? And the most obvious parallel to David, you've got all of Israel scared of a giant. except for this one guy,
Right.
is to go back to Joshua and Caleb
Mm-hmm.
in Numbers,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where all the other spies have gone back to Israel, and all of Israel is too scared because there's giants
Right.
in the land. We can't do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Joshua and Caleb are like, well, no, we are the underdogs here, right?
Mm-hmm.
But God has said he's going to be with us, and so we can do this,
Right. Mm-hmm.
right? And so there's a deliberate connection being made there, and the gigantomachy is what should make it obvious to a reader
Mm-hmm.
between Joshua and David.
Right.
And at the end of the book of Joshua, again, if you're really versed in this, at the end of the book of Joshua, it's like, well, Joshua wiped out the giants, he wiped out the Anakim, except for a few stragglers who escaped into Philistine territory.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And now we're going to see David, starting with Goliath, finish off those stragglers.
Right.
And
Mm-hmm.
so the story is setting up this paradigm that sort of what Joshua began and accomplished, David is now going to kind of put the finishing touches on, right?
Yeah.
And him finishing off the last giants is showing us that, but this, he's going to give Israel a capital city,
Right.
which Saul didn't have,
Right.
right? He's going to take Jerusalem and make it the capital. He's going to establish, right? Saul doesn't have a bureaucracy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or a government even, really.
Right. Sure.
He's like a warlord, right?
Mm-hmm.
We call him the first king, but David is going to establish that, right?
Right.
Like the actual kingdom is going to come to Israel the first time with David.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this is why the idea of restoring the kingdom to Israel gets associated with the son of David, the Messiah, later.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So you stepped into territory that I'm very interested in. So there's a number of things I'd like to touch on here, right? Obviously we have the giants. We've already, hinted at the Amalekites in there, and we've talked about this sort of clearing of the land, right, with regard to Joshua, but there's stragglers in the time of David. So I want to touch on all of those things. Let's just start with a fun little question, right? Which is, I thought with, in the days of Noah, we had gotten rid of the giants. And so how are they back? Right? How are they back?
Yeah. Well, in Genesis 6, it's important to note that it says, in this day and after.
Right.
There were
giants in the land, right? Yeah.
So yeah, and there are various traditions of how this happens.
Right. Right. Did Og cling to the side of the ark?
So one of those is there are some Nephilim somewhere who survived.
Right. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And that goes to all kinds of weird places. We won't go into it now because it's a real rabbit hole. But look up Basque Santa.
Yeah.
If you want to see one of the weird places that tradition goes in the medieval period.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And the one I just said about Og, obviously, as you know, but listeners might not know, I'm not making that up, right? Like, so Og, the king of Bashan, is that who he is, who has the giant iron bed, right? That we're talked about, right? Is one of the traditions is that he clings to the side of the ark, right? And that's how he survives. Right?
Well, yeah. And there's also is Noah a Nephilim?
Right, that odd tradition, yes,
right, tradition. So, and various versions of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are things like the Book of Noah, a version of which is included in First Enoch, which expressly are arguing against that,
right? Mm-hmm.
Right. So they have all this miraculous stuff happen when Noah is born, and then his dad Lamech is like,
right? He's like,
oh no, is he a Nephilim? Like,
right? Yeah.
And has to go and get it confirmed to him that he's not.
Yeah.
But the most likely explanation, and the simplest version of tradition, is just people started doing the same thing again.
Yeah.
And the reason why it's the most
eat all you like, we'll make more. Right?
Yeah, is that people sort of read Genesis 1 through 11 as sort of isolated chunks. Like there's Genesis 1 through 3, that's creation and the fall, and then the boring genealogies, and then the flood.
Right.
Right? And then boring genealogies, and then the Tower of Babel, right?
Right. Are you suggesting that there's something to be learned in those boring genealogies?
Well, they're the connective tissue that makes this all one big story, right?
Oh, I got it.
That connects like Cain to the flood, and then connects what happens after the flood to the Tower of Babel. And you very clearly in Genesis 10 and 11, if you read 10, right? That's it's telling this story about how all the stuff that was happening before the flood starts happening again.
Right. Yeah.
Sort of culminating in the Tower of Babel.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes the message, the mention of like Nimrod, right? And these other sort of proto giant figures, right? These mighty men like in Genesis 6.
Right.
But God then says, hey, rainbow, right? I swore that I would not destroy the earth again.
Right.
Right. And so I'm going to handle this differently this time. And that's the Tower of Babel story, is how he handles it differently.
Right.
Rather than destroying humanity. And so that it all starts happening again includes then the giants. Right. And so now those giants are not sort of this unified force that's ruling over humanity as tyrants, because humanity's been dispersed. There are these clans here and there who are practicing these abominable rituals involving cannibalism and human sacrifice and sexual rights,
yes,
right, involved in the reproduction of chieftains and kings. And so by the time we then get to Israel coming into the land, you read Deuteronomy 4, and this has already been in progress. Like Israel comes to the party late, essentially, because by that time, God says in Deuteronomy 4, you're not allowed to take any of the Edomites' land, sort of your cousins descended from Esau, because I brought them here and I displaced this giant clan and that giant clan and this other giant clan, gave it to them. And the Moabites, who are your cousins through Lot, I brought them here and gave this land and displaced this group and this group and this group. And now I'm bringing you to Canaan. And when you get to Canaan, you're to displace this group, this group, this group.
That's right.
And again, if you read closely, this is not an ethnic thing. He says you must put an end to the abominations of this group, that, right? It's the practices, right, that they're doing that must be ended, right? And it's not everyone in Canaan. There's plenty of Canaanite groups still around.
Yep. Pay attention. Yeah,
but those particular groups, we can't have them doing what they're doing anymore.
Right. Yes. So this provides context clearly for, the work of Joshua in the land of Canaan. It also provides then context for our story with David, where there are still stragglers. Right. And it introduces a very important context for the Amalekites. Right. So obviously,
we're one of these groups.
Yeah. Right. And this goes to a very important feature of, when you look at the sort of counter apologetics, right? The anti-Christian apologetics, things like the Canaanite genocide, slay the Amalekites, leave none alive. All of this sort of stuff is the type of thing that is always pointed to say, look, the God of the Bible is this genocidal, bloodthirsty maniac.
Right.
And so when looking at the Amalekites, right, the fact that Saul is actually loses favor with God because he doesn't kill everybody, right? Like he actually leaves stuff alive, takes stuff. That people look at that and go, I don't know how I'm supposed to look at God, right? The God of the Hebrews as the good guy in this story.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the Amalekites and how we might contextualize what on earth is going on there.
It's always interesting to me that your friendly neighborhood atheist never wants to say the God of the Jews.
Right. Well, of course.
Even though that's exactly who he's talking about.
Right.
But it's fun to press that sometimes.
Right. Yeah.
So, and that whole line of argument doesn't work, right? Because all you have to do is ask that person, first of all, so do you think this really happened? Because our friends, the modern atheist scholars, don't think anything in the book of Joshua ever actually happened.
Right. So this goes to an important, that is a very important question, right? Because one of the first questions that you have to ask is, are we going to read the story? If we're going to press the ethics of it, can we at least read the story on its own terms? Right. And if we do that,
that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Right. Because in the back, what they have is they have both their atheist skepticism that says this didn't happen. And then they have the biblical studies skepticism, although I repeat myself when I say atheist skepticism and biblical studies. But the biblical studies skepticism that says, well, clearly this is just like a polemical, slanderous text, right? They weren't really they were probably just peace-loving nomads hanging out that just they came through and slaughtered him.
Yeah.
But if we set aside that and we're going to say, well, let's just take the story on its own terms, what are the ethics behind, what's actually going on? So let's do that for a minute. Let's take the story on its own terms.
Right.
What are the terms?
That's where you ultimately have to take the atheist is, right? Like, unless the atheist is prepared, which there never are, right, to make some specific historical claims about what actually happened in the late Bronze Age in Canaan. Right. Then we just have the story. Right. As it's presented to us.
Yes.
So whether you believe it's true or not.
So taking it on its own terms, who are the Amalekites?
Yeah. And let me also, and I will get there, but I also want to add, sometimes certain types of Christian folk will, to try to diffuse this, act like, oh, well, this never actually happened. It's just a story. Like that solves the problem. And let me point out, that also does not solve the problem. Right. Because if I came to you and said, I have a text, it's fictional, but from it you'll learn about the character of the God I worship, and I handed you Game of Thrones.
Right. Yeah.
Right. You would be like, I don't know about your religion. Right?
The Lord of Light. He's the Lord of Light.
Right. So that doesn't solve the problem.
Right.
Right. Either. Right. But so the story as it's presented. Right. So Amalek, if you go back to one of those genealogies that people skip.
Yeah.
You find out that Amalek actually comes from the Edomite line, but from a descendant of Esau who married, according to the text, one of the daughters of Lotan. Now you think, well, why does that matter? Why does it just have her name? Well, Lotan is the ancient Near Eastern version of what usually gets translated as Leviathan in English Bibles, right? So she is a daughter of a mythical chaos beast.
Right.
Right, according to the text. And so the idea is this is conveying to us that this is a temple prostitute, right? And that this child Amalek was sired through one of these pagan ritual events.
Right.
And Amalek and the family that then turns into a clan that then turns into a nomadic tribe in the deserts goes on to, for example, decide to murder all of the Israelites.
Right.
While they're moving nomadically through the desert. So this is what this people group did. Right. They captured people, raped, tortured, sacrificed them to their gods, had cannibalistic rituals involved in that sacrifice.
Yes.
The chieftains were born through ritual prostitution. Not all religions are beautiful, right?
Yes. Yes. And Amalekites. What is it? What do their name? What does their name mean? Right? When does it give us any insight into?
Well, that's debated.
Okay.
That's actually debated. So, those are probably. I don't buy.
You don't buy them? Okay.
I don't buy the later.
Okay.
Most of those proposed Hebrew etymologies aren't. Like Moses wasn't called Moses because he was drawn out of the water.
Sure.
Like his Moses is unrelated to the word drawn. Right. Yeah. It's the Egyptian. It's an Egyptian name. Right. Like, but yeah. So I don't go in for that.
Okay. Fair enough.
But just the history, right? That this is what makes you an Amalekite.
Right.
Right. This is the other thing they didn't know DNA existed. Right. So there's not a concept of ethnicity in the ancient world. What makes you part of a people group is that you've been through their initiation rituals and you participate in their cultic life.
Right.
So being an Israelite meant you were circumcised if you were male, or you were the wife or daughter of a circumcised male.
Right.
And you ate the Passover.
Right.
Right. And so it's not just that, oh, yeah, some of the Amalekites do some bad stuff.
Right.
Right. Like what made you an Amalekite was doing this stuff.
Right. Right. Well, and this is where I was hinting at the blood drinker side of things.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Well, they certainly did that.
Right. Yes. So regardless, right. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just like with Moses, regardless of whether or not you buy into that he is drawn out of the water, and that's why he has that name.
Yeah.
There was the reason those connections are made is because they're like, well, this is just, part of the story of who they are. Right.
Yeah.
So whether you buy into the etymology of the Amalekite, the fact of the matter is that being blood drinkers was a mark. Like
you have to fiddle with it a
them,
little to get blood drinker,
but but the mark of it is the practice as much as it is, the genealogical line. Right. That there's this there's an inheritance of a certain line of practice.
And there's no reason to believe that everyone who was part of the Amalekites was born an Amalekite.
Sure. Yeah.
Plenty of people could have come and been initiated into the just like not everyone who was an Israelite was. We gave some examples earlier.
Yeah.
Right. Of people who had other quote unquote ethnic heritages, but were Israelites. Right. Caleb is a Kenizzite, which is one of the tribes.
Yes.
One of the giant clans he was born into. But Caleb, by the end of his life in the book of Joshua, is an elder of the tribe of Judah.
Right.
Like he had no biological relation to the person Judah.
Right. Which in itself makes for, immediately weaves a fascinating tale of somebody who moves from the one tribe to the other and is the most zealous to go in. Right.
So people came in and out of these tribes. And so when we talk about wiping out one of these tribes.
Yes.
Right. What we're talking about is what is now called cultural genocide.
Right. Yes.
We're talking about wiping out that culture, those practices, those beliefs. Right.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I think is so interesting. So there's a couple of different examples of this. So like, are they called the Thrains in Game of Thrones? Are those is that the cannibal guys in Game of Thrones? What
I think so.
Is that what they're called? Anyway, I'm not a Game of Thrones expert. But I think, drawing on my vague memory of it, I think that's what they were called. But the thing is that what's interesting is in the narrative structure of that sort of thing, everybody who's watching that, who is opposed to the Thrains, they're sitting there going, kill them all. Right. Like, you can't leave any of these guys alive. They're too dangerous. They're too toxic. They're too, And so it's interesting that in the right narrative context, that is the impulse of the viewer or of the listener. Yeah. And I saw another example of this, a less known example of this is the movie, what is it called? Black Death. And I don't know if you ever saw that, but it's a fascinating film. And this is going to be spoilers ahead. So jump ahead if you don't want to want the spoilers.
For everyone who doesn't want Black Death spoiled.
It's basically a movie that I would say is 90% great. And then the last 10% ruins it. But what's brilliant about it is you're following this monk, right, who falls in love with a woman. He's torn. Do I abandon, the monastery and my vows and go find this woman? And he prays to God, give me a sign. And then, basically these guys show up the next morning where they're like, hey, and he tells the girl, wait for me over there. If I show up, the day after tomorrow or whatever, that I've left the monastery and we can be together. If I don't, move on with your life. I've decided to remain a monk. And so he prays and he asks for a sign, and these warriors show up. And he's basically like, okay, and they need a guide to take them to, well, the very place he's told this woman to wait for him. He's like, oh, there's my sign, right? So he goes with them. And as they get out of the road, he sees the equipment they're hauling. And they're like, oh, yeah, by the way, we're witch hunters. So if you don't have the stomach for that, you might want to go back to the monastery and we'll find a different guide. And then as the story unfolds, you see them deal with a witch. And the modern impulse, of course, is go, she's not a witch. That's terrible. Ugh, it's so horrible that people ever did this sort of thing and so on. And then they get to this town, right, where they're hunting witches. And all of a sudden, there's a twist where everything's been set up for us to be like, there are no such thing as witches. These are horrible people. It's religious zealotry. It's so bad. And then all of a sudden you see them get drugged and they wake up and you realize it's a town full of witches who are now torturing and killing them. And you're sitting there shouting, going, kill the witches, kill the witches. Now, the plot twist that ruins the whole thing is at the end. They're like, let's do a double twist where we're like, we're not really witches, right? And I was like, well, you just ruined the brilliance of this entire movie. But anyway, but I find it so interesting, and C.S. Lewis makes this point, right? He talks about when he's talking about religious ethics and he's making his moral case, he says one of the reasons people point to things like witch trials is because they don't believe in witches. Right. And that's the same sort of thing that you're talking about when you're talking about the atheist who is like, well, my hidden presupposition is I don't think any of this ever really happened, or that if it happened, it was just a bunch of innocent nomad. I don't take the story on its own terms. But once you take the story on its own terms, the very terms that you talked about, there are any number of stories in which you find yourself saying, you know, these guys got to go. Right. Like the good guys have to come in and take out these bad guys.
Yeah. And the idea that there weren't tribes like that in the ancient world is literally preposterous.
Oh, my gosh. The things that they did in the ancient world are
the Assyrians
scandalous.
Did that stuff and worse and brag about it in their official records.
That's right.
Like,
I mean,
this isn't like.
I mean,
controversial that there were groups doing that in the ancient world.
I mean, you know this, but I mean, some of the things that you would, I mean, this is like viewer discretion is advised, right? The sort of things where they would like kill a person and stretch his skid out on the bed and rape his wife, on the car, like crazy stuff where you're just going, I didn't even know people could be that evil.
Yes. Yeah. But I give a very practical example when talking about this with people where I just say, if you knew for sure, right, like you saw it with your own eyes and he confessed to you that your neighbor was abducting people, right, sacrificing them to a pagan god and eating them.
Right. Yeah.
Would you just like hope he saw the light and like pray for him?
Right. Yeah.
Like, no, of course you would. You would call men with guns.
Right.
To come and put him in a cage to make sure he couldn't do it anymore. And if the only way they could stop him was to use those guns to shoot him, you would not be shedding a lot of tears. Right. You would be like, well, that's what had to happen.
Right. Yeah. And even if you shed tears, it wouldn't be because you think they did something morally wrong. It would be because you think it's tragic that a human being can descend into such darkness.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
like you would be like, you know, nobody's putting flowers on the grave of the family from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Right. Like,
yes. And you are talking about that level of gnarly.
Yes.
I mean, right. So, anyway, so now let's bring this back to Saul. So what is wrong with what Saul does, right? And I have my own answers to this, but rather than, sort of throwing mine out, I'll just leave it for you to, say like, okay, so what is particularly egregious about what Saul does in this case?
Well, so God gives this command, these groups need to be, right? These abominations need to be stopped. These practices need to be wiped out.
Right.
And so part of how God wants to communicate that this is a different scenario than just going to war. That this kind of thing in general is not how you are to conduct yourselves.
Right.
Right. Is that he doesn't allow them to take any spoils. Because this is not about enriching yourself. This is not about any of that. Right. He'll say to them, if you get attacked by somebody and you fight a defensive war, and you end up gaining territory and spoils and stuff, hey, they attacked you, right?
Right. Sure.
Fair enough, right? But in this kind of instance, no, you're being the instrument of God's justice, right? You're putting a stop to these things, right? Just like if you found out the cops looted that house, right? And still you'd be like, well, that's not great, right? That's not why they were there, right? Like
maybe that drug bust was not just about drugs, given that all the money disappeared.
So that's part of how it's communicated, right? And so Saul was, in dealing with the Amalekites, the goal was, hey, these Amalekites, this has to stop, right? But Saul not only leaves some Amalekites alive, he leaves their chieftain, right? The warlord, the one who's behind all of the atrocities, keeps him alive so he can parade him around as a victory trophy. Right. To boost his own ego. And takes tons of sweat, takes all of their herds, which is the way wealth was measured among nomadic groups, right? Basically takes all the wealth for himself too. right? Turning this all into a great victory for Saul, not I am the instrument of God's justice on earth as the king of his people, right? Which is a very different conception.
Right. Yes. And this is where and this is what I think, modern readers, certainly atheist readers, they tend to miss, which is that what Saul did is he told the rest of the world that we did this for the money, right? It is like what this was about looting and pillaging.
Yeah.
And
about me.
Yeah. And about me.
And how great I am.
And to the extent that this is representative of a people who are acting at the behest of God, right? Of the God of Israel. Well, then now what you actually have is you're suggesting that on him, you're actually saying something rather blasphemous about him, that he wants you to go in and just loot and pillage and things like that.
Right.
As opposed to what is supposed to be the message, which is that these practices are an abomination that has to end, right? Like this cannot endure. And this is where slaying the animals and things like that, leaving none of that stuff alive, taking none of that stuff is so important, because that's the only thing that signifies that this is not a raid. And then
he lies about it badly too. Right. Like, because Samuel shows up, it's like, I hear some sheep. And he's like, oh, I was going to sacrifice those to God. That's why I took those.
That's right. Yeah, there are comical moments along those lines. Well, since we've touched on Samuel here, I'm interested in this character, Samuel. I think he's a brilliant, interesting figure, just in his own right. There's a certain irony that I see, and I'm just curious, I'm presuming this is not projection, but there's an irony about the parallel between how Samuel's first prophecy, which just in general, in terms of contextualizing this character, right? Your first, you're a kid, your first, prophecy is like, hey, go tell this guy I'm going to smite him and his kids. And right. Like it's a pretty rough go, right? Talk about, really being thrown into the deep end, right. Right out of the gate. Couldn't I just get a simple prophecy about like, I'm going to hold back some rain or,
we're going to have good crops for 3 years and then not so good in the fourth. Yeah.
Right. Something like that. But you have this, which is obviously instigated by the fact that you have, Eli's sons are desperately wicked. And then you have a certain irony that emerges with regard to Samuel's own sons and the institution of, the instigation, what prompts the people to come through and say, we want a king, right? That we can look on and with our eyes and touch and all that sort of stuff. Is that, I don't think that's projection, or is it, right? That there is a certain intentional sort of an ironic parallel here in terms of Samuel, how his sort of prophetic role begins and ends here.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a little. I think you've imbibed by a Sunday school a little bit of the Puritan reading of Israel's desire for a king.
Sunday school, but okay,
that's coloring the end of that a little bit,
right?
Part of the first prophecy, though, I think a misunderstanding people have about the role of the prophet.
Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm. And the idea is really that Samuel's role is substantially the same as Moses's.
Mm.
Right. He is. And that's part of why he's considered the last judge of Israel. Right. Mm-hmm. Is because he's actually utilizing the kind of authority Moses had, which is ultimately to bind and to loose, right? To apply the commandments of God to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And when you apply those to Eli and his sons, it doesn't look so good.
Right. Yeah. Well, it didn't look so good for Aaron's sons.
Yeah. Think of Moses. The first thing he has to do when he comes down from Mount Sinai is find the golden calf, right? And deal with that whole thing. Right. And so that's part of the role of what he's doing throughout, right? And then Nathan, same thing, when he has to confront David and the prophets in general, when they're pronouncing these oracles about Israel, they're not so much predicting Israel's future as they're saying, look, this is the judgment that's hanging over your head because this is what's going on in Israel, and you should have read in the Torah that this is how God looks at that, right?
Right.
And this is a major element. We were just talking about Joshua, right? The importance of Joshua canonically is not to justify what we did to those people groups.
Right. Sure.
Right. The role of it canonically is this is what God's going to do to Israel when Israel becomes like them. He's going to send the Babylonians and the Assyrians the way he sent Israel.
Right.
Right. To deal with the situation. Right. And so that's sort of what the prophets are sort of always doing. Right. I think at the end, so we have to read the demand for a king in terms of Deuteronomy, right? Deuteronomy already said, you're going to have a king, and here's the kind of king you should have, right? And it sort of describes the opposite of Solomon, right? Do not multiply wives for yourself, and do not.
Sure.
And on. So there was already this idea they would have a king, and that was to follow certain rules. When you read carefully their desire for a king, they say they want a king who will lead them into battle. And that's as opposed to God leading them into battle. And that comes right after they tried to wheel out the Ark of the Covenant, thinking that would give them auto victory. Right. Right. And so when the Ark gets captured, they're like, well, apparently we can't count on God to bring us victory. So we need a king like the other nations have to lead us into battle, which is why they get Saul, right? They get a warlord. Right. So it's not so much they're rejecting God as their king and they were supposed to have some kind of theocracy. Right. It's that the type of king they wanted and why they wanted him. And part of the text is that David was the one who was supposed to be. Right. Right. He's the one that Deuteronomy was talking about. Right.
Yeah.
Despite his sins and issues.
So do you read when Samuel, because Samuel does rebuke them, right? He does say, you have a king, right? The Lord your God is your king, right? You have a couple of different
who leads you into battle,
right? Yeah. Who leads you into battle, right? And so you're reading that less as a rebuke. You're reading that as a rebuke, largely having to do with the interest of the one who leads you into battle. That is primarily a military interest, more so than a movement to be like the other nations.
Right. And then that's connected to what Saul does with Agag.
Right.
Right. In that Saul is taking for himself, right, these prizes, these trophies. Let's all celebrate as Israel. We did this.
Right. Well, and I think there's also, I think also with this, I forget who wrote the article, but there is, I had alluded to it earlier, right? There's an article that tracks all the different uses of armor and clothing in, throughout the narrative, 1st and 2nd Samuel, because obviously you have all these different things. Samuel's cloak, right, that it has significance, and it being torn and all that sort of stuff, as well as with Saul, right, his armor. At least one of the readings of this, my understanding is that this is kind of another one of the many ways in which Saul is trying to present himself as a king like the other nations.
Yeah, it's all captured stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Hodgepodge together. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And this is where, again, it sort of gets into the, the sort of surface level versus a sort of deeper level of things, with David being uncomfortable with that, not wanting to go in without that. And, obviously you can carry that interpretation into there in some sort of, projected significance, whether it's there or not, I'm not sure. But, so I do think you see that sort of thing. But
there's sort of this Puritan kings are bad thing.
Oh, right. Yes. That wasn't what I was, what I was getting at.
Anglophone Christianity.
Oh, I see. That was the puritanical part. Yes.
Where they read it as sort of, because if there's one thing Puritans hate, it's formalism and ritual and religion. But if there's two things they hate, the other one is monarchy. Right.
Yes. That was not what was there in my question.
Yeah, but that colors how that story is read and taught in Sunday school.
Of course, right.
Like Israel should have been a theocracy, but they wanted a king, and sort of human government. Yeah, this ambivalent sort of thing about it, which isn't really there originally.
Right. Yeah. Now, what about here? And this goes into more of an area of metaphysics more so than like, this is where you get into later discussions. Discussions that you can find in church fathers, for example, but, is this notion of divine regret. And so this is an interesting thing, right? Because obviously this is something I noticed all the time. I remember when, discussions from process philosophy and open theism were becoming this big controversial thing where people are debating about whether God has foreknowledge of the future and things like that. And it was so interesting to me that all of these sort of systematicians were the ones who, and these were largely, of course, Protestant systematicians, had certain basic understandings of divine foreknowledge and attributes and things like that, that they just sort of presumed. And of course, then there were certain texts that became boogeyman texts, like talk of divine regret, right? And yet what I always noticed is that in the Old Testament, people like, whether you're talking about like Terence Fredheim or Robert Noose or all, there were a lot of people who were just like in Old Testament, they're just comfortable with this very anthropomorphic language because it's just there in the stories, these idea of divine regret. And I know that, in the church fathers, you can find this sort of how they're looking at these things and saying, well, how do you reconcile God's knowledge of the future with God's, dealing with people and the notion of regret and things like that. But what do you see when you look at this? It's a very interesting thing that you have God ordain Saul and then regret, right? And making Saul king, which is something that just rubs against people's assumptions about God, right? Especially if you want to talk about puritanical presumptions, the very sort of monergistic, God has blueprints and all of these things are set in order and things like that. And regret
people with Plato brain. Yeah,
that's right. It doesn't really fit. It doesn't really fit, right? The schematic sort of approach.
Right. Yeah. So the first thing we have to do is shift our staying a little in the sense that, as you refer to as anthropomorphic language, and that's common, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not actually the position of the biblical text.
Right.
The position of the text is that humans are theomorphic.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. That humans are the image of God.
Right. Yes.
Right. And therefore, these various human properties have a different kind of relationship to what we in Orthodox theology would call divine energies than is usually. So usually the way that language is used is, well, this is from a human perspective and a human way of understanding. We're projecting these human things onto God, but those aren't proper to God.
Right. That is the very contemporary, sort of like modernist.
Right. You're moving from human to God, right? In that direction.
That's right.
And the position of the biblical text is moving in the other direction.
Right.
That these human experiences, right, of love or regret are in some way participations in some aspect of God's activity in the world.
Right. So it's interesting, where you started with this entire notion that when we engage in certain activities, we're engaging in the energies of God, because obviously that is the Orthodox position. And we're not going to go into a long aside on the energies because it would be a whole different episode. And I've got an episode on that. You can go see me talk with David Bradshaw about it if you want to, as well as other places. But it is intriguing to me that, when you look at the way the Eastern Church Fathers talk about the divine energies, there's this one way of looking at them where I think oftentimes people will naturally acclimate toward, and they'll be like, oh, okay, sure. The energies of God when somebody gets healed or raised from the dead makes sense. Divine energies. But it's so interesting that the Eastern Fathers do not actually restrict it to that sort of thing. I mean, you use the example of regret as a participation in divine energy, where we're passing a judgment on our own actions. And it's interesting that Gregory of Nyssa refers to, Christ as virtue itself, right? And identifies virtue as divine, and therefore suggests that when a person becomes virtuous, right, they are in some ways moving in accord with that, which of course goes to the entire image likeness of God distinction that they draw, where the likeness of God is an active participation, in these, divine energies. And so it's interesting to look at regret in that sort of way, because I think the tendency for folks is to, in some ways, insulate those sorts of actions from God, right? There and it's also, and yet, with the Eastern Fathers, you don't see it that way, right? And what's also, what I find intriguing about what you're saying is this also goes to the very sort of distinction with modernity, where modernity has a certain a priori concept of God, right? The highest optimal being. And then therefore, when we talk about certain things about God, it's all just sort of anthropomorphic projection, right? Onto that being that doesn't really apply. Whereas, as you rightly point out, there's something inverted about that in terms of the biblical text, the idea that we are a small sort of shadowy image of, of him, and that there are certain modes of activity that we engage in that when we rightly reflect him, we end up, actually participating, not just mirroring, but in many ways participating in God's own energies. And this is where I found it interesting. The first time I encountered this was, realizing that in people like Origen, that he would say, well, of course God regrets, because the text says he does, right? He says he just regrets with none of the imperfections that we associate with human regret.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think without the concept of the divine energies, there's no solution to the dichotomy between transcendence and immanence.
Right. I agree. Yeah.
You end up with people arguing for Plato's God on one side and then open theism, process theology stuff on the other side.
Right.
And there's no way to bridge that divide.
Yeah.
If you don't have it.
I 100% agree. Right. I do think that a lot of the classical theism is ultimately a God who is fully transcendent. And all the talk of eminence is not actually eminence. It's just effects happening in the material world, but God is off someplace else.
He does stuff.
Right. Right. And we have no access to him. It's just, we just see the things happening that he caused as the first cause, but like there really is no eminence. And then I think the right impulse of a lot of people in process philosophy, for example, is that they want to say, well, I don't think that's actually what God is like. So, but seeing no way of threading the needle, they just collapse God and world. And so now God is just part of the world organism. So he's just immanent and there is no transcendence.
Right.
And it is true. I think the essence energies distinction, in which, again, we're presuming, but we're not expositing here, really is the only way where you can start to say, well, God has a certain nature that is transcendent, and yet, to cite Basil, right, the energies come down to us, and we have that sort of access. And I think what's also interesting, just analogically, that I see with so many of the Eastern Fathers is that as much as that weirds people out with regard to God, they rightly observe, that's my experience with you, right? Like, I don't get to rip open your chest and look at the essence of father to young, or, there are a lot of things about you that are hidden from me. I have an encounter of this sort of superficial experience of your appearance, of your operations that come to me. And through that, I get to know you and infer certain things that sit behind the veil, as it were. But, they'll say that about, my knowledge of you. Basil will say that about my knowledge of me. And so why should I think it's any different when it comes to God, right? The idea that there is something accessible about God by which we come to know him, and yet there's something deeper that is beyond our grasp. It's true of you. It's true of me. It's true of just reality generally.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So jumping back into the biblical story here. Let's offer a fun question here. David and Goliath. We haven't talked too much about Goliath. We've talked obviously generally about these stragglers. A couple of different questions here. David and Goliath cousins? So most people won't know what on earth I'm referring to here. So you'll have to provide context in terms of.
Well, yeah. So this is another alternate, based on some alternate genealogies of David.
Right.
That would connect him to, and alternate genealogies of Goliath. Because we don't really have one. So I guess it wouldn't be alternate. I guess that would just be genealogies.
Genealogies, right.
Of Goliath that would propose that well, and So part of where this tradition comes from, honestly, where it originates, is with the idea of Gibborim. The Hebrew word Gibor, which means it's often translated like mighty man or strong man, is also a word that's used to refer to giants and is used to refer to Goliath in particular. It is used to refer to David and Abner and a bunch of his guys.
Right.
And so whenever you have something like that, you have people ready to draw connections, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Right. And say, well, this must means David is connected to this line,
Uh-huh.
right? Indirectly. A piece of this too, I think, goes to the Moabite thing with Ruth.
Right.
Because so anytime the Moabites show up after the book of Numbers, there is an association between them and what happened at Baal Peor, which is where so Balaam, son of Beor, right, the prophet, gets hired by Balak, the king of Moab, to go and curse Israel. He tries 3 times, but every time he tries to do that, he ends up blessing Israel instead.
Right.
And he sort of figures out, like, well, as long as they're in good with their God, right, there's sort of no way to curse them.
Right.
Right. But he says, if they could be not so good with their God, right, then they'll be cursed, right, by their God. And in the most sort of diabolical way, sort of feeds that information to Balak. Right? It says, hey, this is the way to get them.
Right.
This is why Balaam later is sort of the archetypal, like, false prophet.
Right.
In traditions that show up even in the New Testament. He's referred to in Jude and 2 Peter because of this. He says, if you can get, and so Balak enlists the Moabite temple prostitutes from a high place to go and get the Israelites involved in these rituals, and a plague breaks out, and all of this happens. So even though Ruth is a perfectly nice person in the book of Ruth, just the fact that she's a Moabite woman, right, again, you get these connections and connotations, especially in the post-exilic period, as we mentioned, where the whole foreign wives thing becomes an issue. And so it's like, oh, well, here's a thread connecting David to the kind of temple prostitution that produces giants. And so then a way of elaborating that is we get this family tree where David and Goliath are related.
Right. Yeah. And doesn't that have to do with, right, we have Ruth, you have the whole Naomi and Ruth and the whole, like, okay, you guys aren't going to have husbands, so you should just leave me be. And one of them does leave. And then, Ruth stays behind.
Orpah, leaves.
And my recollection is at least one of the, it's feminists love this story because they see this so slanderous. But the one who leaves ends up, at least one of the traditions, I think, ends up being that there's a very NC-17, night that follows that ends up bringing about giants.
Right. Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's because she's a Moabite and chose to stay a Moabite.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
And then for some reason, Oprah Winfrey's parents decided to name her after that person.
After Orpah?
Yes, and misspelled it on the birth certificate.
Right, yeah, that's right.
That's true. That's how Oprah Winfrey.
That's right. Yeah, I know. Yeah. I did hear that, yes. They probably did not hear the story, like
the rest of
that one tradition about where the story goes.
Would have been better to name her Ruth. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, that would have. Yeah. But then we wouldn't have Oprah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so it does seem like, I mean, I do think you're right that everything I can tell is the stories having to do with some sort of cousins, some sort of ancestral connection does have to do with tracing it back to the Moabite thing and some of these tales related to Ruth and, and Orpah about, these, basically about these Moabite tales of, what happened.
And there was nothing good going on in Moab, right, later on. I mean, remember, we got the king who sacrifices his son, on the walls of the city.
As you do, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's
The
moon god. Yeah.
Yes, but again, like, so this does seem to be. I mean, now, in terms of the level of credence, I presume, you don't give much stock to that sort of.
No, I give basically none.
Yeah. I figured, given that it was largely that Moabite thread that we talked about earlier, that you give it very little.
And Goliath. So, the name Goliath, it turns out, is actually a relatively common Philistine name.
Right.
Like, we archaeologically have records of that name in Philistine settlements, like multiple Philistine settlements.
Right.
And none of them are referring to the biblical figure as far as we can tell.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. There's no evidence that any of them are. So it seems like that was just a Philistine name.
Sure. Also, Goliath brothers, right? Like, this is another thing that shows up, that we have other giants that show up, and David and his mighty men end up, Jonathan.
Well, the whole who killed Goliath, because one of his other mighty men kills someone else named Goliath.
Also named Goliath, yes.
Which is related to the whole, there were lots of
Goliaths.
Right?
Like, he killed Joe, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, which one, right? And so obviously there's a certain case that ends up being made. I think this might be actually more of a contemporary case again, in point, but trying to trace those other giants in some ways to Goliath and say that they're all brothers. And I know that I know we've discussed this before, but just not here. And it's like a lot of things. So Goliath, brothers, the other giants related to him. Yes, no.
Well, So among these groups, and especially among the ones who were considered giants, right? Well, let me say this first. So part of the thing that's misleading about this, or what makes people look at it in the wrong way, is the word giant, right? Obviously, in our modern parlance, refers to somebody who's really tall.
Right.
I am defending my Dutch heritage here because we are per capita the tallest people in the world. We're not all evil.
Congratulations.
So and in the Greek version, I'm only 2 inches shorter than Goliath. So
there is that.
So the idea is size is here being referred to to tell you that they're a giant. Right. Telling you that they're a giant is not to tell you that they're a tall person. Right. And it's sort of like the example I always give is, and this is dated now. I realize a lot of people don't remember this now, but I'm old enough to remember when Manuel Noriega was taken down by the U.S. military. Right. And he was always referred to as Panamanian strongman Manuel Noriega. And by that, they didn't mean that he had this really impressive bench press. Right. Like, he's just this really ripped guy. They meant he was a dictator, right? He's a tyrant. Yeah. Right. But referring to him as a strong man was symbolic of that. Giant is similar. Right. The word we translate giant can also mean just tyrant or bully or thug. Right. Yeah. Right?
So we talked about this in the previous one.
Yeah. And so we have to kind of remember that too. Right. Yeah. So we're not primarily talking about some physical attribute they possess. Right. That said,
so this is
that's why I wanted to qualify that first.
There are large beds.
There are large beds. And with a lot of these brothers who show up in the text and get killed, they have like 6 fingers and 6 toes. Right. They have these other weird physical deformities.
Right. Yes. Right.
And this is very ableist and non-PC and bad by our current understandings.
I am an ableist.
Not just in the ancient world, but for most of human history, right? In stories, when you're trying to say that a character is evil or wicked or corrupt, often they are described as possessing some physical markers. Right. Of that corruption or twisting or right. Yeah. And so that's sort of what that is aimed at, right? Is saying they're kind of monstrous, right? You find this with a lot of giants all over the world, like the Fomorians and stuff. who are half fairy and half are also misshapen and
Right.
have
Two rows
you
of
know
teeth, or these
yeah. So
strange
you
things.
get these things.
Mm-hmm.
That said,
Mm-hmm.
where I was going with all this is among these people who would be considered giants, the chieftains, there was a lot of inbreeding,
Right. Mm-hmm.
right? Because they were seen to be part divine,
Right. Mm-hmm.
and you can't sort of dilute the divinity and the divine seed. You see this even probably the most famous example of this in the ancient world are the Egyptian pharaohs,
Mm-hmm.
who were very frequently married to their own sisters,
Mm-hmm.
right? And stuff because again, it's this divine bloodline we have to
Right.
keep together, and you see that emerge as physical deformities in some of the Egyptian pharaohs, Tutankhamun being one example.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then those physical deformities were taken as marks of divinity,
Mm-hmm.
right, by the Egyptians, and were pointed to by like the Israelites and other enemies of that as actual signs of evil rather than signs
Right.
of divinity.
Right.
So there
So
is a material scientific element of deformity
mm-hmm.
coming by inbreeding.
Sure.
And so all that is to say, yeah, Goliath and the other giants were probably closely related 5 different ways.
Right. Yes. But not necessarily brothers.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Not necessarily. We'll
But they
say
were
not necessarily.
kin.
Right. Yeah, yeah. They were kin. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, just on that, I don't want to brush past that because I know that the last time you did an appearance on my podcast and we talked about this, I know that some people were like, so are they big or are they not big? And I think this is where I think the use of the word primarily is so important in what you said, because it's
Right.
kind of like the Amalekites, right? Where it's like, well, yeah, the Amalekites are descendants of Amalek, right? But you don't have to be in order to be an Amalekite, right? And so in the same way, when you're talking about the giants, like we do have very large beds that are meant to indicate this guy is really, really, really big, right?
Yes.
And so
yeah.
you do have that. You do have
and to tell you that he's a giant.
right, and
Yeah.
to tell you that he is a giant, right? And you do have these other oddities like 6 fingers and 6 toes, right? Again, say he's a giant. And yet at the same time, the term itself is not semantically limited to you have to be 12 feet tall in order to be right,
Right.
like in order
Right.
to qualify as this, right? And I think that's just an important thing for people to understand. So now this goes to another question, right? Which is that, how is it or why is it? And is there an explanation for why, certain giants end up, amongst the Philistines, right? Because obviously with the Amalekites, it's part and parcel just of what they are in their culture that you're engaging in these sorts of practices. It makes sense that the whole of that people would be there. But the Philistines, are oftentimes treated as Proto-Greeks, more sophisticated.
Well, they were basic. They were displaced Mycenaeans. Yeah.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
And so in this sense, it's sort of an odd thing to think of them as engaged in the sorts of practices that, odd to at least how we might romanticize a certain people who are Proto-Greeks, right? Or displaced Mycenaeans, right? It might not compute to be like, well, then why are there giants? If this is what giants are, right? They're related specifically to these abominable practices. Why is it that we find giants in the ranks of the Philistines?
Yeah.
Do we have an answer?
Yeah. So Philistine culture in that period was not practicing those things.
Mm-hmm.
But close reading of the end of Joshua and what's going on here is that it's not saying the Philistines were still doing those things. It's saying that sort of some of the members of these clans got away from the Israelites by going into Philistine territory.
Right.
And the Philistines the reason they remained part of those clans and didn't just become Philistines is because they continued those practices.
Right.
So the Philistines sort of allowed for it.
Right.
And in terms of why the Philistines would have allowed for it, people have a very warped understanding of Greek culture. Ancient Greek culture, to be blunt. Ancient Greek culture is far darker than our current understanding.
It's not all Plato?
Our current Plato is far darker than our current.
Okay, fair enough, but we don't talk about those things.
Yeah. But we've gotten Greek culture and everything filtered through the Enlightenment.
Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Where a bunch of French philosophers basically recast the Greek philosophers and the great orators and these great figures as themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I'm amazed at how many people go with their assumption that, say, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle didn't practice the standard Greek pagan religion.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right. I mean, like if you read Plato, he's doing things like, oh, this is a great insight. We should go offer sacrifice.
Yes. Aristotle's school
gratitude.
was in a temple of Apollo.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, well, this is it just in general, just as an aside on this, I think I think what most people don't realize is the entire differentiation of philosophy from theology or philosophy from religion is a modernist invention.
Yeah.
It's just not there in the ancient world. They're all asking and answering the same questions, and it's all highly integrated. It is not a sort of like, we have this academic practice over here where we engage in dialectic, and then we go over here and,
Yeah. But these Enlightenment philosophers said, well, we consider the religion of our day to be dumb and superstitious. So surely these great minds
that's right
of the past must have considered that even more primitive religion to be primitive and and superstitious, right? And not participated. Yeah. And so everybody's in white togas and standing around and orating at each other all the time and all of this.
Yes.
And, and you get, Frank Miller writing 300 and, oh, this is a battle between light and freedom and this and slavery and tyranny and darkness. And you're like, the Spartans had just as many slaves as the Persians.
Right. And I think the Spartans even poke fun at the Athenians for being boy lovers in that.
Yes, exactly. I'm
pretty sure the Spartans were doing the same thing.
Yeah. So we've got this whole, the Athenian democracy lasted about 5 minutes and almost no one could vote,
Right.
Like,
yeah.
So, but anyway, so we have this weird, right? People don't know, for example, that, the reason Lycaon won the first Olympic Games is that he sacrificed and ate an infant to Zeus on an altar on the mountain overlooking where the games were going to be held, and it gave him wolf powers.
Yeah.
Right. And that infant sacrifice took place there several times at subsequent Olympic Games.
Zach Schneider, if you're listening. Next.
Yeah, there you go. Right? Like that's part of, right? By the way, that place where that altar was, where he supposedly did that, there's now a church dedicated to the prophet Elijah there.
Hey.
Somewhat ironically.
Look at that. No, I mean, but you're right, because like even when you look at Plato, like obviously Plato does get into trouble, obviously, because he does believe that there's something wrong with the Homeric myths, that he does end up coming to this conclusion about, the good and this higher deity. But the idea that somehow it falls away from Plato's thinking, that you have lower gods, that you have demons, right? That his demiurge does delegate. I mean, it crafts the world and then it goes back to contemplating the forms and delegates to the world the entire pantheon, basically, that you have within Greek thought. And that's one of the reasons why, for him, he continues to be someone who offers sacrifice and is engaged in these sorts of practices. Yeah. So even if there's something enlightened, so to speak, about Socrates and Plato, the idea that somehow there is an enlightenment awakening with Plato where he abandons pagan religion or something like that is plainly false. I mean, just reading his dialogues, you can tell that.
Right. Well, yeah, the argument of the Euthyphro is not that the pagan gods don't exist. All Plato does is depersonalize the gods.
Right.
So instead of Aphrodite, who's going around, sleeping around and doing this and that, you have love.
Right.
Right. Just depersonalized. Right. And justice and power and strength. And he just depersonalizes them and says, yeah, those stories are to try to help teach, people with less understanding certain, moral truths, but it's not really worthy of them. But he just depersonalizes them. It's functionally the same religion.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Just he characterizes them as being a little less petty, and Zeus is
Right.
a little less rapey, and
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
but yeah, so within the Philistine culture, right, is the memory of their earlier phase of culture where they did human sacrifice, where they did
Mhm.
at later phases of Greek culture, they were sort of embarrassed of that,
Right. Sure.
right, and viewed this as sort of dangerous and stuff, right, but it was there, right,
Right.
and so the idea that they sort of allowed these other groups to come and, who were living nomadically anyway,
Right.
primarily.
Mm-hmm.
The Philistines had 5 major cities, and then the rest was farmland and land, that they let them settle somewhere and continue doing what they were doing
Right.
based on some perceived, well, yeah, we have that back in the, you
Mm-hmm.
know,
Yeah. Well,
it's
yeah.
totally reasonable,
Yeah. Well, and I think this is something that, again, speaking of the sort of weird Enlightenment sanitized version of Greek culture, and here you're not even talking about Greek culture, right? You're talking
Yeah.
about a sort of a proto-Greek culture.
Yeah.
Is that like it's actually a late development in Greek thought that you even have a concept of justice that somehow dictates, the whims of the gods. I mean, in the older
Right.
Homeric religion, you basically have, I mean, the gods are not sort of operating according to some objective universal standard of right and wrong. Good. The gods are just like our guys versus your guys. And it's only later in people like Hesiod where you're starting to get like this poetic, like this justice that's higher than the gods that all appeal.
Well, and even then, it's very conditional.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. So for Aristotle, even, the Athenian constitution is sort of the perfect expression of divine justice.
Mm-hmm.
Just so happens the place where I'm from is right.
Mm-hmm. Of course. Yeah.
And the best place, right? Whereas if you asked a Spartan at the same time, right, he would have said Spartan society is a perfect representation of divine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they were taking their own and just applying it universally.
Right. Yeah.
They weren't so much trying to abstract from like, there was no sense of there's a divine justice that would judge Athenian culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or that other cultures would have to conform to, another city state would have to conform to. Right.
Right. I mean, you do start to have forms of idealism emerge, but certainly that's just such a late development in the culture and in the philosophy itself. And it's not even a mainline thought. I mean, this is where people like that thought is contrary to the going practical wisdom of most people. And so, and the reason I bring that up is to say that the idea of a utilitarian approach that says, well, if these gods or these people can help us, why not give them safe haven and let them help us?
Right. And they'll do their thing. And we might think it's primitive. We might even think it's bad or horrible, but
but why not use it? Right.
They're not us.
Right. That's right. And so I think that's one of the things that is sort of missed, that even if you had a more sophisticated culture, right, that, turns up its nose at certain things, it wouldn't do that because it's idealist, right? Idealism of that kind doesn't exist yet. And there's ample amount of utilitarianism when it comes to military action and all the rest.
Yeah. So, the Greeks looked down on the Egyptians for having theriomorph gods, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like animal form
right
gods, but they didn't go and try to convert them.
Right. That's right.
They're just, here's reason 84 why we're better, right?
Right. That's right. Put it on the list. So I think we have time for one more thing. And so let's circle back to something that we touched on and we didn't really get to, which is, I mean, everybody loves a good post-apocalyptic story. Now, we tend to always project those forward, but you don't have to go forward into like, post-nuclear fallout or zombie apocalypse to get there. You can go back to the Bronze Age. So, talk to us. You already touched on this, Father, the fact that we're in the context of a post-apocalyptic story when we're talking about this. So for folks who don't know, what on earth does that mean?
Yeah. So people tend to look at, well, we move from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, and that's like an advance, right? Like iron is better, right? Mm-hmm. And it's actually not. That's There was, so in the height of the Bronze Age is the mid second millennium BC. So circa 1500 BC. We're talking about the original Babylonian Empire period when Hammurabi is the emperor. Um, Hammurabi actually also technically a giant. He was what the Bible calls an Amorite, which comes from the Akkadian word amuru, which means Westerner, because it was a group of people from what's now Syria who migrated into Babylon and kind of took over the course of a couple generations. And Hammurabi was one of those emperors. But the world during that period was intimately connected by trade routes. To give you an idea, we call it the Bronze Age because they're smelting bronze. They were getting the copper from Cyprus. That's where Cyprus gets its name.
Right.
They were getting the tin from what's now Afghanistan. Right? Bringing it together and smelting bronze. Hammurabi himself had this affection for sandals from Crete. Apparently they were in a certain style that he liked.
Yeah.
And would get them imported from Crete. So we tend to think that like the world was completely disconnected until like the 20th century.
Yeah.
And now we're all united because internet and stuff. But
that's right.
In the Bronze Age, it was very intimate. It took a lot longer for caravans to get places, but there were these established trade routes and caravans moving things back and forth all the time, all the way from the western part of India and the western part of China, all the way into Western Europe.
Right. Yeah. Which this is very disruptive for a lot of the ways a lot of people today have learned about history, where everybody's just sort of isolated. They have no knowledge of anybody else. There's no contact. And there's just increasingly, there's more and more problems the more you dig on that conception of the way the ancient world was.
And there are these different governments and great powers and Egypt and the Babylonian Empire, and Babylonian Empire was sort of the superpower of the time, but there were other ancillary powers. And at the end of the second millennium BC, so we're talking about around 1100 BC, all of this collapses due to a bunch of factors.
Right.
One of the big factors was actually climate change, even though they didn't have any power plants or anything.
No. Yeah.
Just climate patterns change right, over the course of time. And especially when we're in a world where 99% of people are farming, when climate patterns change and crop yields change or disappear, you have land that wasn't arable that becomes arable, land that used to be arable that now isn't. You get people groups that start migrating. When you have mass migrations of people, you get wars.
Right.
One of those mass migrations was the sea peoples.
Right. Yeah. The people of the sea or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is the Philistines were one of those. We've already kind of referred to that, where a group of people from around Crete and the Greek islands were forced, because they couldn't grow food, forced to migrate, came down, attacked Egypt. Ramses managed to repel them when they attacked Egypt.
Right.
And they settled along the coast.
Right. And we actually have the memorial, like, or like paintings, right? The Egyptian memorializing that, right?
Yeah. And so that's where they said all the Philistine cities come from that. Other groups, a lot of the tribe of Dan in Israel is actually one of those groups. One of the Sea Peoples groups. They're actually the same people as the Danae that Homer talks about.
Oh, really?
So lots of these things happen. The Babylonian Empire collapses. You also have empires and political units that can't feed their people anymore. And so everything breaks down. And so the reason the Iron Age starts is that smelting bronze is now impossible. And so the remnants of that, if you have a bronze helmet, a bronze spear, all the bronze stuff Goliath has, that's sort of like a magic item. That's like, we can't make this anymore.
Right.
Right. This is ancient now lost technology.
Right.
And from this previous golden age.
Right. And add to that, of course, that it was you said magic item, right? Like in their mind, there's not really a difference between science and magic. And in many of the traditions,
Right.
this is from the gods, right? Now,
Yeah.
whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing depends.
Yeah.
Right, on the storyteller. But
Yeah.
the idea that you would look at somebody like Goliath going, not only does he have lost ancient technology, but that it's magic, it's from the gods, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's something very significant about that in this tale.
Yeah. But I mean, and this is the point with bronze, that there are Philistine temples where in the most sacred space, they have sort of their holy items, the idols and things, ancient idols and things. And there's stuff just like bronze chariot hitches,
Right.
like just random bronze objects that are back there because that's how sacred, right? They're viewed as, that were brought from where they migrated from, right? And now we can't recreate this,
Right.
And so everyone's living. This is why we're talking about Saul being more like Conan, right? Like living in tents with furs, right? Like people are living in the ruins of that civilization.
Right. Yeah.
The buildings they're building they're like with wood or stone, crude stone, trying to rebuild and add on to the remnants of these greater buildings and patching city walls and stuff from this previous era of greatness.
Yeah. And my recollection is like Saul's fortress in Gibeah that's basically a former Philistine fortress, right? Like we actually know where it is and its dimensions and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's relatively small, but yeah.
And isn't it basically just a repurposed sort of.
And they would literally, whenever it was taken, it would have been breached and parts of the walls destroyed.
Right.
They would just sort of stack rocks
right.
to fill the holes and then plaster over them with literally plaster over them.
Right.
Like simple plaster. It'd be like, okay,
that'll do.
Yeah. That's
right.
Because that's what they could do. Right. And so that period, another similar period, if somebody wants an example to look at, they actually did this really well in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, because it's in Saxon England, and Saxon England, they were really living in the Roman ruins.
Okay,
and so there are a lot of examples. The way they show the buildings is actually really historically accurate, where they've got like wooden structures and stuff to try to semi-repair and make usable what's left of the old Roman fortress or the old Roman wall or the old Roman, building, and you could definitely tell what's Roman and what's recent, right? It would have been the same kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, which is really weird for people who haven't done a lot of traveling abroad. But, you go around to a place like Greece, you can see literally just in real time, you can see in old churches, for example, okay, I can see that over here, these are the old foundations. I can see the way the old architecture was built. I can see that this used to be an icon, but it's so faded that you can't even, I mean, I can see the outline of a figure, right? And then you can just see the new church built on top of it. And there's just like this weird piecemeal of like all these different stages of history. Now in America, of course, everything's so new. We're not accustomed to that sort of thing. Right. Yeah. But you travel around the world and you see it firsthand. It's all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah. But so it's, these bronze items, these other relics, these people claiming to have this knowledge from the old period. It's sort of like, pick your post-apocalyptic movie, finding the Coca-Cola in the road, or, that's right. Or the King James Bible in the Book of Eli. Spoilers.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, like these are these, sort of artifacts, of this time they're now. So there's this huge retrograde in technology and in during that whole period. Right. Yeah. And like we were talking about with the militaries, right. They don't have real weapons at this point. Right. They don't have,
Yeah. I actually do have one more question before I let you go. I can't see a clock. Are we all right on time? Do you have time for? Okay. So just one more question. I want to talk just briefly about things like magic and divination in the tale. And the reason I want to bring this up is because there's just some interesting things. We've talked about different traditions, right? And you brought up certain medieval, traditions. I think it's in the the Jewish medieval midrash, where Abner is, I think he's the son of the witch of Endor. And so there's some sort of claim, right, having to do with, Abner. And
well, he's described as a Gibborim, right?
Right.
So,
yeah. And so there's, I think that's, so they sort of extrapolate that out and make him like, oh, that's the connection with the witch of Endor. And obviously you do have, in later parts of the story where Saul goes and consults with the witch of Endor. So we have this sort of divination thing, but it's far from the only instance of this, right? We have the Philistine seers, right? First of all, I love that the text makes the point to say the prophets weren't called prophets yet. They were called seers.
Yeah.
Right. And so Samuel is a seer. But he's not the only seer in the text, right? You have the Philistine have their own seers where they're sitting here trying to go like, well, I don't know. I mean, something's going on here.
Balaam's out there for hire. Yeah.
Right. That's right. And so you have these other seers there. And then you have these sorts of odd, just sort of out of nowhere appearances of idolatry. For example, like in the story of David's getaway, once he's caught, right? Once Saul knows, and he and his men have to hightail it out of there. It's like, okay, let's take this giant fertility idol, and throw it in here and decorate it, as a decoy. And it's like, why is there a fertility idol, a life-size fertility idol, in the fortress? Talk to me a little bit about, specifically this question. What it raises for me is a natural question that starts to emerge of like, obviously the ancient world was steeped in magic, right? You have amulets, you have magic users, right? We can look at all sorts of actual magic practices. We have magic texts, from around that period. Obviously, you have certain forms of divination and things like that were involved in temple worship and so on. And obviously, Israel is told, like, don't do that, right? Like, don't.
I'm sending you a prophet, so you don't need to do that.
Yeah, so don't do that. And yet, somehow you see these sorts of remnant, leftovers that are still there in the story, right? It's not really commented on, but it's just kind of there that somehow, like, Saul got rid of all the practices of witchcraft, and yet he still knows where at least one of them hangs out.
Yeah.
And one of his generals is maybe tied with her, and and then you've got idols in the fortress and things like that. Do we have any clarity on what the relationship is with regard to magic and divination, around the time of Saul and David, in this period? And we just sort of left with just these clues.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, the careful reading of the Bible, this is one of those other great things. You get these documentaries and everything where everybody acts super credulous. They're like, well, the Bible says that the Israelites were monotheists, but look, we found all this evidence of all this, magic and stuff. And it's like, have you actually read the like, at all? Right. Like,
yeah.
It says they were supposed to be.
That's right.
Only worshiping Yahweh.
Right.
They weren't supposed to do this stuff, but it also says very clearly over and over again that they were still doing it anyway. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, so there's a number of pieces there. Right.
Yeah.
What generally separates magic from paganism, right? Mm-hmm. What's the difference between somebody doing a magic ritual and someone just doing a pagan worship ritual?
Right.
Is, paganism involved, the regular paganism involved personal interactions with spirits.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. And the idea was you had this sort of give and take communication, right? Or trying to get them to do something, woo them by offering them things, right. Et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whereas magic was seen in terms of like techne in Greek, like you mentioned, is technology, right? Meaning you do the ritual the right way, you get the right results.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
There's certain knowledge, right? So one of the most common forms of divination was practiced by, the Latin word for it is a haruspex, which is a great word.
Right.
And that was the guy who would read the entrails of an animal that was sacrificed. Right. And there would be signs. But we have in the ancient Near East, from this time and before, from the time of David and even before, we have they're fired clay. That's why they've lasted. Sort of the same kind of clay as a tablet, but it'll be like a sheep's liver.
Right.
And then it has like cuneiform writing on it to tell you, like, oh, if you see a spot here, it means this.
Right.
If you see, it's like the training kidney, right?
Right.
For would-be haruspices, right?
That's right. Yes.
But it's a kind of technology, right? It's something you learn how to do.
Right.
And so the practitioners of magic and the practitioners of divination, these things, are the people who are sort of trained and have this knowledge of how to do it. They believed this knowledge was revealed during this prior golden age by the gods.
Right.
Often the gods who reveal it are punished by other gods.
Yes.
And that's because of the nature of magic.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Because, you've given humans the means to like manipulate us or do something in some way.
Yeah.
Think Prometheus for the Greek example. Right.
Yeah.
Because this was seen as you could manipulate things. You could make things happen through magic.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is where I think what sort of strikes people as odd about it is, to the ancient mind, basically the presumption is when you're talking about, like, well, in Greek, if you're talking about like physis, the nature of a thing, right? Like from which we get physics, they didn't restrict it to just like the elements, right? There is a nature of the human person. There's a nature of the soul. There's a nature of an angel, right?
Yeah.
And so
gods.
the idea was the physical laws were not restricted to just inanimate stuff or something like that, right? Physical laws had to do with just reality. And so the presumption was, of course, yeah, sure, there's physical laws we can learn about, like metal. But of course, there's got to be also physical laws we can learn about spirits.
Yes.
About names.
How to get the person next door to fall in love with you.
That's right. Things like that.
Yeah.
So it was just the difference is, and again, this kind of goes to a modernist invention where there's sort of this differentiation. It's the type of substance dualism that you get like in the Cartesian world, where it's like, well, there's stuff that extends in space and there are physical laws for that. And then the other stuff just doesn't have physical laws. Right. And so physics becomes about the inanimate stuff that you can poke and prod. Whereas in the ancient world, it was presumed, no, physical laws just have to do with reality. These are laws of reality, period. And so just as you can discern laws about metal, you can learn laws about spirits and names and symbols and, all this sort of stuff and figure out how to manipulate it.
Right. Yeah. And modern people wonder, well, what about when it didn't work? Right. It's like, well, it just had to work enough.
Right.
Right. And then when it didn't work, because of their understanding of it, that it was applying these techniques and stuff, that it's, well, you did it wrong.
Right. Mm-hmm. Sure.
You made some mistake in the procedure somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
And that's why it didn't work in this one case. But look at these other cases where it did.
Right. Yeah. This is actually where, I don't know if you ever watched the show Supernatural, but this show, where you have these ghost hunting, like sort of like monster hunting brothers. I think it just, even though it doesn't take itself very seriously, but I think it very well represents this sort of ancient pagan mindset, because what's interesting in the show is, the premise of the show is that there's this subculture of hunters and so like every urban legend, every monster and every religion is true in some way, shape or form. It's just that most of us don't encounter it. And there's this subculture of hunters that goes out and kills vampires and werewolves and whatever else. And, to keep the rest of us living our sort of delusional lives that says none of that stuff is real. And these brothers, what's interesting is they always do research and they'll look into magic. They'll look into this, they'll look into that. But what's interesting is, I forget how far into the show you get, they have an encounter with an angel and, or what seems to be an angel. And this weirds one of the brothers out where he's like, angels, like, come on, next thing you know, you're going to tell me that you like pray. And the other brother's like, I do pray. You don't. And you realize they've never had a conversation about worldview. Like they don't know if the other person believes in God or believes in angels or whatever else. They don't know any religious practices. And you realize they're just doing whatever works, right? Like, well, I guess if we say these words, we get this simple. They're just operating it in a way that I think is really reflective of the way so many ancient peoples who toyed with magic approach those things.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Or you look at amulets and stuff. I went into battle wearing this amulet and see, I'm fine.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to keep wearing it.
Absolutely.
Can't hurt, right? Like
that's right. That's right.
All those kind of things, right? You hate somebody, you put a curse on them, something bad happens to them. well,
Yeah.
bad things happen to people. And sometimes probably there was some actual demonic activity, and, because we're dealing with a whole bunch of pagans.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Do we think it's plausible? I mean, obviously we have Saul has runs into problems with his deity with the Amalekites as a result of the Amalekites. And we know that at some point he turns to divination. He's trying to summon Samuel. I need to know what Samuel would tell me. I'm going to go to the Witch of Endor. I mean, do you think it's plausible when we see things like the fact that within the fortress you have a fertility idol? Do you think it's plausible that in the wake of that, Saul begins to turn to other gods or toys with magic or things?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely. And of course, David doesn't. That's not his issue. He has other issues, but
he's got other issues. Yeah.
But Solomon certainly does.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. We find out later on when we get to King Josiah that Solomon built a chariot of the sun god idol in the temple courts. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it wasn't just he built other temples to other gods. It was even within the temple of the true God, he propped up an idol.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is one of those dicey areas that, you don't talk about in the Sunday school version.
Right.
I mean, maybe you do with the really bad ones, right? But
the Sunday school version of Solomon, the best you get is, well, he was really wise, but polygamy is bad, kids.
That's right. Right. That's right. That's right. Well, since we finally got to now, and knowing is half the battle. Yeah. It's a G.I. Joe reference for anybody who is. Anybody who's too young to know that. So anyway, all right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up on polygamy is bad, kids. I
confirmed this message.
That's right, Father. Thanks for joining me, and thanks for working with me, and hopefully we'll continue to talk more in the future. So with that, we close out our discussion. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.